as you're seated, I encourage you to take your Bibles and open them to the book of James. And today will be message number 4 in what's going to be a 19-part series as we walk verse by verse through the most practical book in the New Testament. 54 commands in the book, written by the half-brother of Jesus, and probably the first New Testament book to be written. And we've entitled the series, When Faith and Life Collide. And as James opens the book, he deals with when faith and life collide during trials that come into our life. And we saw a couple weeks ago as we really began to enter into that discussion that trials are normal. We all face them. You're either in a trial, just came out of a trial, or you're ready to go into a trial. One of the three. We saw that trials are numerous. They come in all shapes and sizes and durations. But we also saw that they're needed. And according to the Bible, our response to trials is we are to consider it all joy when we encounter trials. And we spent time making sure we understood that's not talking about your feelings. It's not a verse saying, don't worry, be happy. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that in the midst of your sorrow, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your grief, your tears, your mourning, in the midst of all of that, you can still think forward with joyful confidence in God. Now, why can we do that? And we saw earlier in the series, we can do it because we know something. This isn't about your feelings, it's about your thinking. What do we know? We know that God will use trials to produce something valuable in our lives. We saw specifically in James chapter 1 that God will use trials to prove the genuineness of your faith. He will use trials to strengthen your endurance to hold up underneath the trials. And he will use trials to produce spiritual growth and spiritual maturity in your life. And because you know that God will do that, even in the mourning, the sorrow, the hurt, the pain, the grief, the tears, you can still think forward with joyful confidence in God. And we learned last week that if you're having trouble seeing your trial from that perspective, you can ask God for wisdom. And what is wisdom? It's the ability to see things through God's lens, through God's perspective, and he will give you the wisdom. Now, today we're going to see another reason, another tool, a hint, a help to get us to the point where we can, when trials come into our life, think forward with joyful confidence. Now, at first glance, the verses we're going to look at today almost appear as if James has started a new topic. It appears that he's no longer talking about trials, but instead in verses 9, 10, and 11 of chapter 1, he's now talking about wealth or the lack thereof. But when you look at it contextually, I think it's very clear that even though James is talking about wealth or the lack thereof, he's still talking about trials. Now, how do we know that? Because when we get to verse number 12 today, which is where we'll end, he's going to say, blessed is the man who endures trials. So verses 2 and verse 12, those two verses kind of act like bookends. And everything in between is dealing with trials. Now, we'll see next week when we get to verse 13, he's going to go to a new topic. And the new topic will be, how do we respond when faith and life collide in the area of temptation? But even though verses 9 through 11 seem to just be talking about money, they really are talking about trials. And they're going to teach us a very important truth. A truth that we need if we're going to be able to consider it all joy, to think forward with joyful confidence in God when trials come into our life. And basically, here's what he's going to say. For you to do that, you need to focus your thoughts not on what you have or don't have materially or physically, But you need to focus your thoughts on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. And if during the trial you will focus your thinking on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally, it will help you to, during that trial, think forward with joyful confidence in God. So, that seems like a good point to read the passage. So I want to read James chapter 1. I want to read verses 9 through 12. And I want to ask you, no matter where you're watching from, any of our campuses, Alpena, Sault Ste. Marie, watch groups, wherever you're watching, if you're physically able, would you stand with me, please, in honor of the Word of God? Still talking about trials. Here's what James says. But the brother of humble circumstance, in other words, the poor believer, what is he to do? He is to glory in what? His high position. And the rich man, notice he's given the same command. He is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too, the rich man, in the midst of his pursuits, will fade away. And now he wraps up the section on trials and says, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. And may God bless the reading of his word. Thank you. You may be seated. So in this passage, James is talking to two groups of believers. He's talking, number one, to the believer who is economically poor. And he's talking, number two, to the believer who is economically wealthy or rich. The poor and the rich. Now let me ask you a question. Who did he leave out? He's talking about the poor and he's talking about the rich. Who did he leave out? Everyone in the middle, right? Everyone. Because I bet you that if we took a poll today, most everyone who's listening right now, whatever campus you're at, my guess would be that most of you would say this. Well, I'm not poor, but I'm not really rich. So I guess I'm in the middle. So I guess this doesn't really apply to me. I'm not poor, I'm not rich. But here's what you have to understand. That back in this day, these were the only two categories. There was no middle class. That's a modern thing. There was nothing in the middle. You were either a have or you were a have-not. You were either really rich or you were really poor. There was no in between. So when James says, I'm going to talk to the poor man and the rich man, he's really talking to everybody. Now, in our culture today, we have different classes, don't we? And so you might say, yeah, there's the lower class, there's the middle class, there's the upper class, right? And really, we have more than that. If you really break it down, you will hear economists say, well, there's the lower class, the middle lower class, the upper lower class. There's the lower middle class, the middle class, the upper middle class, the lower upper class, the middle upper class, the upper class, and then those with no class at all in anything. So we kind of break it all over the place, don't we? And but when James wrote this, it literally applied to all of his readers. You were either rich or you were poor. In fact, most of them would have been on the poor side. And so you need to understand that this passage, though you may be going, I'm not rich and I'm not poor, really does apply to you, to all of us. Remember, the concept of am I rich or am I poor is very relative, isn't it? Because it really kind of depends on who you compare yourself to. If you're going to compare yourself to Elon Musk, you are very poor. But if you're going to compare yourself to others, you're very rich. In fact, this week I looked at the up-to-date statistics on the Institute for World Poverty, and here's what I discovered. Think about this. If you make $3 a day, $21 a week, let's just make it easy, say $1,000 a year. If your income is at least $1,000 a year, you are more rich than 700 million people in our world. Think about this one. If you make $7 a day, let's just say $50 a week, $2,500 a year. If you make $2,500 a year or more, you are more rich than over half the people in the world. You see, really, the idea of rich is relative, isn't it? Someone shared with me a few years back a great definition when they said, if you have a choice, you're rich. When you woke up this morning, if you could choose between the red shirt or the white shirt, you're rich. A lot of people in the world didn't have that choice. If today you have the choice to eat hamburger or chicken, you're rich. If you choose eggs, you're filthy rich today, right? If when your bladder woke you up at 3 o'clock this morning, if you did not have to put on a coat and walk down a path to a tree somewhere in order to make your bladder happy, you're rich. Rich is relative. And really, what you need to know is this. No matter where you are economically, this passage applies to you. Because even though James is going to come at it from different angles, he's really saying the same thing. Whether you're rich or whether you're poor, set your mind in the midst of your trials. Set your thinking not on what you have or don't have materially or physically, but rather set your thinking on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. I think because this passage is still in the context of trials, it teaches us something else. That trials are the great equalizer. In other words, trials happen no matter what your economic class is. Poor people and rich people die of cancer. Poor people and rich people are struggling to take care of a parent or a spouse who has Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, dementia. Poor people and rich people have to plan funerals and stand next to freshly dug graves. Trials are the great equalizer. And James is saying this: no matter what your economic class is, no matter what you have or don't have, physically or materially, if you in your trial are going to think forward with joyful confidence in God, you need to set your thinking not on what you have or don't have physically and materially, but rather set your thinking on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. Well, that was a long introduction, wasn't it? So let's break it down into two parts. We're going to spend most of our time looking at the circumstances of life, and then we'll end our time looking at the crown of life. So let's look at the circumstances of life. And in verses 9 and 10, we see a dilemma of materialism. And the dilemma really affects you whether you're poor or rich or whatever class you are. So he begins in verse 9 talking about the poor man. And who does he call him? He calls him the brother of humble circumstance. The brother that has very little, which again would have been probably the majority of his readers. And what is that poor person contextually who's going through a trial? What are they to do if they're going to be able to think forward with joyful confidence in God, here's what they have to do. They have to glory in their high position. Now, the word glory would really be the same concept as verse number 2. Consider it all joy. Same thing. It's not an issue of feelings, it's an issue of thinking. And what do they who have very little, the poor, who have little materially, little physically, and they're going through a trial, what should they glory in? He says, you glory in your high position. You who have a low position materially, you now need to glory in your high position spiritually. In other words, you need to set your thinking not on what you have or don't have physically and materially, but rather on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. And if you will do that, James says, it will help you to think forward with joyful confidence in God when trials come into your life. Now, what I'd like to do is I would like to read 3 passages of Scripture that describe for us that high position that James is speaking of. 3 passages that we need to be reminded of if we're going to set our thinking on who we are spiritually and what we have eternally. These are 3 passages that, especially when you go through a trial, you need to read over and over and over again to keep your thinking right. And the first one is found in 1 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse number 3. Notice, no matter where you are on the economic scale, notice your high position. Notice who you are spiritually, if you're a believer in Jesus, and what you have eternally. And look what it says. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, according to his great mercy, has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And so James would be saying, if he was kind of partnering with Peter here, he would be saying, you who are of low, humble circumstance, don't think about what you have or don't have materially and physically. Think about who you are spiritually. And no matter what trial you go through, listen, you who have put your faith in Jesus have been born again to a living hope. And the trial doesn't change that. It's who you are spiritually. But it's not just who you are spiritually. It's what you have eternally. He goes on and says, because of this, you have obtained an inheritance which is imperishable, undefiled, will not fade away, reserved for you in heaven. No, you may not have much now, and you may be going through a trial now, but keep your thoughts on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. And he specifically now, Peter, just like James, brings it to the point of trials. Look what he says. For you who are protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice. In what? That I've been born again to a living hope, who I am spiritually. That I have an inheritance reserved for me in heaven, what I have eternally. You rejoice in that, just like James said. Let the brother of humble circumstance rejoice, glory in this, even though now, for a little while, if necessary, you've been distressed in various trials. Peter is saying the same thing James did. When you go through trials, you need to put your thinking not necessarily on what you have or don't have physically or materially, but rather on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. Let me read another passage. 1 John chapter 3. Look at verse 1. 15 years ago this month, I preached my first sermon here when I candidated. This is the passage I preached on. And if you were here, you might remember a connection to gravy. I'm not going to talk about the gravy today, but here's what it says. See how great a love the Father has bestowed on us that we would be called the child of God. That's who I am spiritually. I may not have much materially. I may not have much physically, but I am a child of God spiritually. For this reason, the world does not know us because it did not know him. Beloved, now we are children of God, but it has not appeared as yet what we will be. It's not just who I am spiritually, it's what I have eternally. Because we know that when he appears, and ladies and gentlemen, he will appear, we will be like him. Because we will see him just as he is. This is what James is referring to when he says, let the brother of humble circumstance glory in his high position. No, I may not have much materially. I may not have much physically, but I have this. I am a child of the living God, and I have an eternity of amazing things in my future. Look at another one, Romans 8. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. That's who I am spiritually. But it's not just who I am spiritually, it's what I have eternally. And if children, heirs also, heirs of God, fellow heirs with Christ. That's what I have then. And look at, he connects it to the suffering. He says, for indeed we suffer with him so that we may be glorified with him. Look, this is amazing. For I consider the sufferings of this present time, and Paul went through horrible sufferings. I consider the sufferings of this present time, they're not even worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed. So what does James say to the poor believer going through a trial? He says, listen, don't put your focus on what you have or don't have physically and materially. Instead, put your focus as you go through this trial on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. And if you will keep your focus there, it will help you in the midst of your trial to think forward with joyful confidence in God. Now in verse number 10, he's going to address the rich man. He's basically going to say the same thing, just from a different angle. Who's he talking about in verse 10? Very clearly, the rich man. And what is the rich man to do? Well, just like the poor man, he's to glory. He's to rejoice. But he's to rejoice in what? Not in his high position, but in his humiliation. In other words, here's what he's saying to the rich man. As you go through your trial, you need to rejoice in this, that even though you are blessed with more materially and physically, the truth of the matter is you will one day lose all of that, the humiliation. You won't take any of it with you. None of it. And so just like the poor man, what is James saying to the rich man? When you go through the trial, don't make your focus what you have or don't have materially or physically, but rather set your thinking on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. And why is the rich man to do that? He says, because like flower and grass, he'll pass away. Yes, you may be blessed with much now, but you're not going to keep it forever. You're not going to have it for eternity. That stuff will not go with you. By the way, this is a concept that is used all throughout the Bible. Peter talks about the temporariness of life being like grass. He says in 1 Peter 1:24, for all flesh is like grass, and all its glory like the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower falls off. Isaiah used the same terminology in Isaiah 40, verse 6. A voice says, call out. Then he answered, what shall I call out? Well, here's what you call out. All flesh is grass. Its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, and when the breath of the Lord blows upon it, surely people are like grass. He's reminding the rich person of the duration of materialism. And that's why in verse 11 he says, the sun rises with a scorching wind and withers the grass, the flower falls off, the beauty of its appearance is destroyed, so too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away. Over in Israel, there are some times of the year where it's pretty lush, a lot of vegetation, a lot of flowers. But on any given day, that scorching wind can come along, and by the end of the day, it's all gone. It's all gone. And that's what James says materialism is like. So in essence, here's what he's saying. Whether you're the rich man or whether you're the poor man, or for us, anyone in between, as you go through your trial, don't focus on what you have or don't have materially and physically. Instead, put your focus on who you are spiritually and what you have eternally. And that will help you in the midst of your trial to think forward with joyful confidence in God. And then we get to verse number 12. And verse number 12 is the capstone. This is the verse where he sums it all up. This will end the section on trials. It begins in verse 2, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. It ends in verse number 12, when James says this, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. It's a repetition of verse 2. Verse 2 said, when you go through trials, consider it joy because that will produce endurance in your life. Now in verse 12 he says, and blessed are you when trials produce endurance in your life. They're the bookends. For once he's been approved because he endured the trial, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. When I look at that verse, the first thing that stands out to me are two reasons I see in the verse as to why we should endure trials. Why we should do what James commands us, to consider it all joy when we encounter trials, knowing that the testing of our faith will produce endurance. Why should we do it? What will it cause in our life? And I see two things. Number one, the first reason we should do it is there will be contentment in our life in the midst of trials. And that's what the word blessed means. Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. I told you in the introduction of this series that there's a lot of connection between the writing of James and the Sermon on the Mount. James wasn't a believer in Jesus when his half-brother gave the Sermon on the Mount, but it seems pretty obvious to me James was there that day on the hillside in Galilee when Jesus preached that sermon. And after James becomes a believer, that sermon kept coming back to him and impacting him. And if you remember in that sermon, Jesus begins his sermon, the greatest sermon ever preached. This one's the second greatest. That's the greatest sermon ever preached. And he begins it by using the word blessed 9 different times. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Blessed are those who are persecuted. And the word blessed is very similar to the word joy in verse number 2. Consider it all joy. It's speaking about not a feeling, but an inward contentment. An inward contentment in the midst of my trial that says, my God is in control and I can trust him. Blessed is the man who can consider it all joy when he goes through various trials. Now here's the truth. You will never experience true contentment until you experience the contentment of God in the midst of your hardest trial. You see, anyone can be content when life's good. It's easy to be content when I'm healthy. It's easy to be content when my kids are behaving. It's easy to be content when I have enough money to pay all my bills and do extras. That's not real contentment. Real contentment is what you experience when you go through the deepest trial. And even in the midst of the trial, you can say, I am thinking forward with a joyful confidence that my God is in control and I can trust him. I'm thinking forward with joyful confidence because I know he will use this trial to produce something valuable in my life. I am thinking forward with joyful confidence because I'm not thinking on what I'm going through physically and materially. I'm thinking about who I am spiritually and what I have eternally. And when you can experience that, you will understand what true contentment really is. And I think that's harder to experience today than ever before. For a lot of reasons. I think one of the biggest ones, and this isn't a knock on it at all, but it's just truth, is social media. Experts tell us, studies have shown, the more you scroll social media, the more discontented you will become. Studies show the more you scroll social media, the more you will battle bouts of depression. Why? Because when we scroll social media, what do? We compare our life with what we see in everybody else's life. And we forget that most people are just posting the highlight reels of their life. And so you scroll through it and you begin to have thoughts like this. I wish my marriage was like that. And now you become more discontent in your marriage. You scroll through it and you think things like this. I wish I could buy a new car. And now you become more discontented with where you are financially. You scroll through it and you say, I wish I could take that trip. And the more we scroll through it, looking at the highlight reels in people's lives, the more discontent we become. Because most people only post the highlight reels, unless, of course, you're posting on Gaylord, helping Gaylord, then you post everything. But most people only post the highlight reels. I really had to think about that. A couple weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, I got back from vacation. I was meeting with a group of pastors, and we were talking. And one pastor was a pastor of a very, very small church, was sharing his discouragement. And I was really feeling bad for him. And then he looked at me and said, well, Scott, how's it going to be free? It seems from your social media like everything's perfect there. He didn't mean it in a bad way. But I had to stop and think. Because, I would post a lot about what God was doing here at E-Free. In a celebration of what God's doing. And suddenly it hit me. I wonder how much of what I'm posting is causing him to become discontent in ministry because I'm only posting the highlight reels. Trust me, for every good thing I post, I could post 10 bad things. I know more dirt about this church than all of you put together. I truly believe that. I could use your names when I post. Which I only do on Gaylord Helping Gaylord. Just kidding. So I thought to myself, you know what? I wonder if maybe, because I'm not saying you should do this, not at all. Not saying this at all. And I just decided, temporarily, I'm just going to take a step back. I'm not going to post on social media for a little bit. I'm not going to scroll through it for a little bit and just kind of see, how does that affect my psyche? And once you know it, the time I decide to do that, my team wins the national championship and I can't post about it. That's crazy. But anyway, I'm not saying that's bad social. It's a good tool. I still check all the messages on it because that's how a lot of people communicate with me. But I'm just saying, folks, listen, we live in a culture today where contentment is hard to find. And there's a lot of things in this culture that will bring you more discontentment. And James is reminding us that when we go through trials, if we can think forward with joyful confidence in a God who will use that for something valuable in our life, if we can think forward with a joyful confidence, knowing who we are spiritually and what we have eternally, then not only will we grow as a Christian, grow in our maturity, but listen, we will experience a contentment like we've never experienced before in our lives. Until your contentment is found in your trust of God, you've never experienced real contentment. So one of the reasons we should endure trials is because it brings contentment. Secondly, it brings consistency amid trials. That's what endurance is. It's staying faithful, no matter how bad the trial hurts, no matter how long the trial lasts. And then in that verse, after giving the reasons, he shares with us the reward. And he says, those who do this will receive the crown of life. And I think he's talking about a literal crown. I believe that when we get to heaven, God will give a special reward to those who endured great trial and stayed faithful to him. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what it would be like to be standing in heaven and having Jesus look you in the eye and say, thank you. Thank you for being faithful in the midst of your trial. Here, I want you to wear this. But as I read the book of Revelation, I discovered that won't be the epitome of the reward. As incredible as it would be to have Jesus put that crown on my head, the great reward comes, according to the Bible, when I recognize that only he is worthy. And I have the privilege of taking that crown off of my head and placing it at the feet of my Lord and my Savior. You see, if we're truly going to be able to consider it all joy when we encounter various trials, instead of focusing on what we have or don't have materially and physically, we must set our thinking on who we are spiritually. That cannot be changed. And what we have eternally, it's in the bank. And I think that was never captured more beautifully than in a hymn written by Esther Kerr in 1941. We sang it this morning down in the chapel. And in a demonstration of extreme mercy, I'm not going to sing it to you, but I would like to read the words. Here's what she wrote. Oft times the day seems long. Our trials hard to bear. We're tempted to complain, to murmur, and despair. But my friend going through the trial, listen, Christ will soon appear. His chosen ones to claim. All tears forever over in God's eternal day. And then she writes, it will be worth it all when we see Jesus. Life's trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse, just one glimpse of his dear face. All sorrow will erase. So friend that is going through a trial today, I say to you, bravely run the race till we see Christ.